Hello, everybody. Welcome to Preserving New Jersey, Save Ellis Island's new speaker series. So glad that you could be here today. We're highlighting the Garden State's contributions to American arts, culture, intellectual life, and the built environment. So especially people that have a strong connection with Ellis Island. So I'm going to be moderating this series, and I'm looking forward to it, to tonight and the ones in the future. My name is Jean Zimmerman, and I'm an author, a historian, and an educator here at Ellis Island. Save Ellis Island is the nonprofit partner of the National Park Service that works for the restoration and the reuse of the historical buildings on the south side of Ellis Island. So I'm so pleased to have Lloyd Handwerker with me today. So Lloyd, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
A pleasure to have you. So we're going to be talking about your grandfather, your amazing grandfather, Nathan Handwerker, his boyhood in Poland, his passage through Ellis Island as a teenager, his great contribution to American culinary, to foodways, food culture, as the head and the heart behind the great food empire Nathan's famous. And you have done a great documentary and a great book about your grandfather, and we will talk about them. To begin with, though, I want to talk to you a little bit about our tour around the South Side the other day. We walked around together and I enjoyed it so much. How did you like the experience?
Loved it. Really excited to have that opportunity to go on that tour. I've been to Ellis Island a couple times, but had no knowledge of the hospital and the other grounds around Ellis Island. And, you know, to be able to walk through those ruins or semi-ruins and to imagine what it must have been like for my grandfather to be there in that environment, or that, you know, in that place at that time, or all the people that came through there, right. Some who ended up in the hospital. Right. Was emotional and quite moving.
Yeah. So we have a few pictures, actually. Maybe we could see them from our visit. So there you are.
That's me with a hard hat, yeah.
That's you with a hard hat. That's in the morgue. So Save Ellis Island has been restoring these spaces since 1999. And I know that you said that some of these spaces, they were particularly moving for you. And we'll talk a little bit more about your grandfather, Nathan, and his parents later. But I know you said that when we were in the morgue and we saw these cabinets where cadavers were stored, that brought something about for you emotionally.
Yeah, well, it turns out my grandfather's mother, who came on a ship much later than my grandfather, passed away on the ship coming to the United States. So I was just I hadn't thought about it much, but I was trying to imagine what happened when she arrived on shore, what they did with her body, whether they brought her to the morgue or you know, could this have been the place where she was brought?
Right.
I know it was a very emotional scene with all the children down there. In fact, it was written up in a Yiddish newspaper. The story of her death on the ship and the children's reaction to it.
And they had to raise money to allow for her body to be brought back to shore, right?
Yeah, they were talking about throwing her overboard, actually. And I think they had to, I guess, prove that they could bury her when she came to the shore, right? Okay. They had to send money. They had to gather money together and wire it in order to prevent that.
Wow, what a time that was. So let's see a few others of these pictures. So that's, again, you standing in front of the psychopathic ward. And that's a very interesting place. But I know that those pictures interested you.
Yeah, that's the graffiti artist, JR, French graffiti artist, right? Mm-hmm. So right. I thought that was a wonderful commission to have those images of people throughout the buildings, because it gave you a sense of you know, ghosts there, of people that had passed through at one time or another. So they were quite evocative.
Let's see a few more. Okay, there's that one. What about the next one?
Right, yeah. Inside one of the halls.
Yeah.
Right, porcelain, old sinks there that have remained since those days.
Right, I think what you said is you'd like to have that one in your house.
Yeah, I like the design. I like the design sense and style they're nicer than modern sinks to me.
So one thing we talked about is sort of the patina. So let's just look at this for a minute. So you are in an interesting business. Describe it for me about surfaces.
Right. Well, my partner and I, Leslie, we have a business called Surface Workshop, and we rent surfaces to photographers and art designers, for photo shoots, for whether food photography or advertisement. So any kind of surface could be something that, has an old patina. It could have freshly new paint on it. It could be marble, metal. It's just endless types of surfaces that get rented and used in backgrounds or on surfaces that food is placed on. So that place has some really beautiful, surfaces, the walls, the paint, the way it's faded over time, the way it's cracked, things like that. I mean, Leslie wasn't on the tour, but I know she would have been really excited to see some of those walls in there.
Right. I mean, I know you kept saying things like, oh, I love plaster.
Yeah, I like the texture. I mean, again, it's real. It's not just sheetrock, and flat paint. There's a human touch to it. There's a quality, of a human behind it, and there's a craft to it, and then just the aging of it too. It creates another beauty, another level of beauty as well.
Yeah, sure. So let's talk a little bit, speaking of history and beauty and all that kind of stuff, about a little bit about your grandfather's childhood. Okay, so he was brought up in Poland when Austria occupied it back at the turn of the 20th century, and it was called the poorest province in Europe. So tell us a little bit about his upbringing.
He was one of 13 children. My great grandmother and great grandfather were super poor. He was a shoemaker. She was a homemaker. At some point, she had a little vegetable stand in the market, but he knew what hunger was. He grew up very poor, extremely poor, worked really hard from the time that he was 6 years old. He was apprenticed as a shoemaker, never spent a day in school in his entire life. So he was essentially illiterate. Like he said, I didn't know how to read or write. I didn't know how to add 2 + 2. But he was there learning how to make shoes. And then at age 11, he was in a bakery, working in a bakery for 2 years without his family, in another town far away, just to earn some money, so the family could survive, because they didn't have much to eat often.
Right. So when he worked in the bakery, I know that he used his earnings to help support his family even then. So tell us a little bit about that.
Right. I mean, he made a little bit of money, and when he left after 2 years, he took all the money that he made and he went to what he said was the finest butcher in Poland, because the cows were fed uncooked food, right? No, sorry. They wasn't like, grass, etc. Right? They were fed cooked fruits and vegetables as such, right? So they had a particular flavor, I guess, the meat. And somehow he knew that. He must have probably been sent there by the baker at some point. But he took all his money, bought food just so he could bring it home to his family, so they'd have meat, which probably was a rare item on their table.
And he was just a kid.
Yeah, he was 13 when he left. So he was there for 2 years, basically working through the night, baking knishes and bread, and then selling them during the day, carrying a basket to the railroad station where there was a baker. There was a store where he would sell the bread, plus on the street. So he was, working pretty long hours, pretty rigorous work.
Right. Well, there was one story about him seeing a sugar cube.
Yeah, well, that's just an example of how poor they were and how hungry he was at this one particular moment. He saw a sugar cube up on the shelf, and just imagine it was pretty black from the soot of the coal that they used to heat the house. And he just grabbed it, snatched it from the shelf, and said, I wanted to snatch it quickly so no one else would have seen it. Popped it in his mouth, and that was his sustenance for that moment, for that time. I know that tells you a lot.
It's also amazing that he remembered that for the rest of his life. I mean, because he
Yeah.
talked about that in an interview that he had with your cousin, I believe, much
Yeah,
later.
he did an interview a year before his death when he was about 80 years old, and it was a, like 3 hour long interview, and he must have had a photographic memory because the details about his childhood in Poland were unbelievable. I mean, names, street names, people, you know, amounts of money, just like really remarkable detail about his life back then.
So what do we know about his desire to go to America? When did he decide to go to America, and how did that come about?
Right. Well, I think it was something that most immigrants knew about. I mean, at some point, his oldest brother, who wasn't that many years older than him, had come to America. So he probably heard from him at some point. I mean, he couldn't read, but he must have, you know, he had some other brothers and sisters who had a little bit of schooling. So they probably translated some of the letters that came. But it was, I think, every immigrant's dream at that time, especially living in that kind of poverty with the anti-Semitism that existed in Poland as well, was to go to America. And so he dreamed about it often, he said. It was something that, you know, was in his mind. And when he had a chance to leave Poland, one of his other brothers was in Germany. He took that opportunity, and, you know, his goal was to get to America, earn enough money making shoes in Europe and some other European countries so he could get a ticket together and board a ship over to the US.
So he actually ended up having a little bit more money than some of the immigrants that came over. And I know that he took special care to protect it when he was on the ship coming over. How did he do that?
Right. Well, I guess he heard that there were pickpockets on the ship, so you had to be wary of them stealing your money. So among other things, he picked the top bed of a 3-bed bunk, right? Because he said it would be harder for a thief to get up there and steal his money. But he slept with his shoes, and he had money in his socks. And every day he would go out onto the deck, and he would take off his shoes and take the money out of his sock because it was smelling, right? It wasn't very, you know, there wasn't a lot of cleanliness aboard the ship. There wasn't a chance to take a shower and whatnot. So he was hiding money. And
yeah, he was in steerage, you know, like
yes,
so many other people that came to Ellis Island.
right.
So one thing that he did, though, is he actually was smart enough to learn how to sign his name on board the ship. Is that right?
Yeah, well, someone signed his name, gave him a piece of paper, and the entire voyage he would practice. Again, he didn't read or write, so he just was looking at the name on a piece of paper and just trying to copy it until he got it down solid, so that when he arrived at Ellis Island, he could actually sign his name.
And that was important.
It was important to him, I guess. Well, I guess some people did. I read that some people signed their name with the letter X.
That
right?
happens
If they
sometimes.
didn't even have the ability to sign their name. But yeah, I guess to have the correct name and the correct spelling,
Right.
and to be able to sign his name was important.
Right. So just in terms of the food aspect of it, you know, he had been so hungry as a child. So what did he do when he got to Ellis Island and there was food available there?
Well, I know that because he said that on the ferry from the boat to Ellis Island, he bought a whole pie, which was a nickel.
Uh-huh.
He said he didn't remember what he drank, but he remembered that he had a whole pie.
Uh-huh.
Once he got off of Ellis Island, I mean, his brother actually met him there. He took him right away to a place to eat, and I don't think he specified what he ate, but he just said it was like his brother said it was like, you can eat all you want for 10 cents, essentially.
But I think it's funny what you said about the pie for 5 cents, how important 5 cents was going to be. And we'll talk about that some more, but 5 cents was pretty important in his,
Yes, that's
made him
true.
famous, right?
Yes. It repeats itself a lot.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about that. So, so when he first came to Manhattan, then what were his first jobs?
The first job he got was as a shoemaker. He got a job on the street somewhere in the Lower East Side making shoes because he knew how to make shoes. He had that skill already. And I think I remember him saying that he was introduced to metal nails. In Europe, he was using wooden nails.
Uh-huh.
But he said he was always very confident about things,
Uh-huh.
surprisingly for his lack of education. He said, he caught on very quickly.
Mhm.
So he did that, but he knew he didn't want to be a shoemaker from early days. And then he got a job in a luggage factory for a while, I think sewing seams on the luggage, something like that. And then he said, I knew I didn't want to work in a factory. I didn't want to breathe the dust, and he didn't want to be in that kind of environment. So, and he always felt like he was going to work in a restaurant. I don't know if that's because he had worked in a bakery and because food was so important to him, having been hungry a good part of his childhood. But his next job was, and he saw these ads. One of his brothers helped him read the ads and told him where to go. He got a job in a restaurant called Max's Busy Bee. It was a chain of these restaurants, like a luncheonette. And he started off as a waiter, cleaning dishes, super hard work ethic. And he said they were so clean that right away he was appointed to be a busboy. Then from there, he became, he worked on the Frankfurter griddle, and, he just kept getting, better and better jobs.
And he learned to speak
Right.
English along the
Right.
way. How did that happen?
Right. He just learned English as a busboy. He also had to pitch in and take orders from people. And so his first words, he would learn how to, repeat the order. If someone said, I want a coffee or half a pie or half a lemon pie, he would repeat the word without knowing what it meant.
Uh-huh.
So he had to just imitate whatever he heard until, he eventually started learning those words, all the restaurant words that he needed to know to do what he needed to do.
And
Plus some
go ahead.
jingles to sell the Frankfurter too. I guess at some point he learned some of those as well.
So, how did he get to Coney Island? I mean, there's a
Right.
funny story about Coney Island at that time. I mean, it was so popular already, and it was so well visited. And there's a funny story that I like about Sigmund Freud visiting Coney Island, and that was in 1909, and he called it a mistake, a giant mistake. But he said it was the best thing that America had to offer. So how did Nathan get there?
He heard about it from his sister. By this time, he had been working for 2 years at Max's Busy Bee, and because he had some free time on the weekend, I guess because of the Sabbath, he was off in the afternoon, and then Sundays was closed. His sister Anna was already working at a job in Coney Island. Told him about it, and he went out there with one of his cousins one day just to experience it, and started looking and asking around for a job.
Okay.
Eventually found a job at a famous place called Feltman's in Coney Island.
And that famous place had hot dogs. So
Right.
what about hot dogs? I mean, is it called a hot dog because people thought it was made with dog meat, or how did that come about?
Yeah, there are a lot of different stories about that, but I guess one of them is that it looked like a dachshund, right? The shape of it, the curve of it looks a little like the dog. So there were some cartoons like that with the dachshund. I mean, he always called it a Frankfurter. It was something I don't think he ever called it a hot dog, but that became a very common name to use. And and also I think there was dog meat. There was horse meat and dog meat in those days that was eaten at times. So I don't know, combination of all those things.
Yeah. So what was Nathan's like when it first opened up? And I think we have some pictures of this period also. So maybe we'll see some pictures. Yeah.
Well, he found a very little stand, on the corner of Seaside Walk, which was an alleyway, and Surf Avenue. And at that time, it was like, 5 by 8 feet, very primitive stand with, the floor was sand, basically, without, much electricity, without a bathroom. And initially, he was selling mostly drinks of various kind. He had, lemon, grapeade, orangeade, fresh pineapple. He had malted milk. He made his own sodas, root beer, things like that. And he had, again, some food. He was selling Frankfurters, hamburgers, and what they called potato chips at that time, which is French fries. So very simple menu. And he was only doing that on the weekend. He was still working at Max's Busy Bee for a while, and because he wasn't making enough money at the stand. In fact, initially when he was selling a Frankfurter for 10 cents, he made like $50 during the weekend, and that wasn't even enough to probably pay the rent over the course of the month. So that's when the famous story comes in where he decided that he was going to reduce the price of the Frankfurter and sold it for a nickel.
That's what we want to talk about. Yeah. So that was that price point. Was that the key to his success? And there he is in this picture.
Yeah, that's him in much later years, but he's doing something with, I'm not sure what that is actually, if it's fish or shrimp or, you know, batter on it. But, well, yeah, I mean, it turns out that once he reduced the price to a nickel, he said $260 that weekend as opposed to 50. So obviously, you know, you could feed a family for not much money if your Frankfurter was a nickel as opposed to a dime. It mattered. It was, you know, double the price or half the price. So
that was so smart, you know, and it wasn't only the price though, it was also, I think, the freshness, right? Wasn't he sort of a fanatic about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people think about it as a fast food joint or fast food restaurant, but you know, everything was bought at the market in the morning, and you know, the potatoes were fresh. They came from Maine. The Frankfurters came from a factory, of course, but they had butchers who made the hamburger patties. Later years, they had sandwiches of one kind or another. But yeah, there was no frozen food. There was no frozen seafood when the seafood came in the 50s. Everything was fresh, really good quality. He was a fanatic. He tasted everything. If he didn't like the Frankfurters, he would send the whole truckload back.
Amazing.
So he was very particular about the food and, you know, caring about the customer and the customer's happiness around the food.
And he actually traveled up to Maine to get the potatoes, right? And you told me he there was a whole trainload of potatoes, right?
Yeah, I mean, you know, later years, the quantities of food went through that place were enormous. So yeah, he would go to Maine. He knew the farmers. He would pick his potatoes. And he would buy the whole crop, the whole farm's crop. And then they would ship it on many railroad cars and store a lot of it in a warehouse. And, you know, everything according to his specifications. So he knew potatoes. I mean, and that, you know, relates to the fact that he worked on a potato farm when he was a kid in Poland too. And he once sold potatoes in the marketplace with his mother. So he had expertise in some of those things that later in life, you know, he became famous for.
Wow, yeah. And so I know that it was a partnership with him and your grandmother. And so he met Ida along the way. And tell us a little bit about how he persuaded. So he met her through his sister, Anna, right?
Yeah.
How did he persuade? Yeah, go ahead.
No, well, Anna Singer and my grandmother had a little place, a little stand as well on another street.
Yeah.
And my grandfather would go over there and visit and see that they weren't making any money. So he offered my grandmother, you know, a really good salary to come and work for him. So basically closed down his sister's store. I guess he was attracted to her and interested in her. Yeah. So, you know, and he could see that she was a hard worker like him. They were very much alike in that way. And, you know, gradually decided that he wanted to propose. But you know, there's a very long story, but the short story is that he had his sister go and ask Ida to marry him. Like he was too shy to even, you know, do it himself. And he promised her he would give her $50 if she agreed. So he was bribing her to propose to my grandmother. So I guess she accepted eventually. After she said, I have to ask my parents. But I guess after she asked her parents, they agreed. And they got married.
So what people say a lot is that it was Ida who provided the secret spice that flavored the Nathan's Frankfurter. What about that?
Well, that's, I'd like to say that was true, but it's more public relations than fact. I mean, it is true that, I mean, the Frankfurter came from high grade. They made a very good Frankfurter, the best Frankfurter at the time. They had certain spices that they put in their Frankfurter.
Mhm.
My grandparents definitely tasted the Frankfurter and made suggestions here and there, but it wasn't like you read sometimes in the newspaper where my grandmother's grandmother's secret family
Yeah.
spice was passed down through the generations and ended up in the Frankfurter. You know, at some point they had public relations people and they came up with stories that sell well,
Right.
to the public, and then they start to, people think they're fact, but
Right.
it was a little more nuanced than that. But she was a good cook. She was a great cook. She also worked in the kitchen for decades, for many hours, sitting on a crate, peeling onions, chopping potatoes, working on the griddle when she was, in the earlier days. In the early days, it was mostly family working in there because it's such a big family. But then, later he hired all kinds of workers because there was much more work involved. It was much busier, and you needed to stand on your feet in front of a griddle for 12 hours or wherever you were working. So he hired outside help. But yeah, she was there for many decades. I mean, that was as much her place in many ways as my grandfather's, although he was the boss, I guess.
Right. I mean, there's a funny story about her holding a kid on one hip and flipping francs with the other hand or something like that.
That might be true. I mean, I mean, she was working there when she was having kids, and I know my dad was in a Frankfurter basket or something, when he was a little kid in the store.
Yeah.
Where they were working out on the counter or in the kitchen. So, clearly, and that famous picture we saw earlier, they're all up there in the counter. My grandmother's holding one of her children, my uncle, I think. So I mean, it might be true literally, but sure, they were working with the kids around.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about who worked there, since you were mentioning that. Were they just teenagers, or what kind of people were they?
I mean, in the early days, like I said, it was family, and some of them were teenagers. Some of them never went to school themselves. They had to help support their families. I mean, we're talking about Depression era days as well as, earlier and later. So, people that went to work there often ended up making that a career. They were often, many of them, the ones that I knew, excuse me, were there 30, 40, 50 years, even some of them. Wow. So it was something they did for their lifetime. So yeah, some of them were very young, but I mean, they age. You can see pictures over the decades of the same guy in the same position, one of my relatives serving hamburgers, into his 60s, So you could just see the age over the decades of them in that position on the counter.
Well, I heard something about one of the people that work there saying, oh, you have to be like a horse. Nathan hires people that are like a horse to work there.
Right.
And it seems as though he was a bit of a horse himself.
Yeah, he was short but stocky, and hard worker. You had to be really tough to work there, because not only the demanding, aspect of working there for those many hours on your feet on a hard floor, but when it was busy, the speed at which you had to serve people pushing into the counter wanting food. So you had to be super fast, as well as, just good at whatever you did, because my grandfather was a perfectionist and he was on you, particularly the managers. He really gave the managers hell if he saw something that wasn't right. He didn't yell at the workers, but the managers were his enemy. So one of the managers said, if you were the manager, you were the enemy. In other words, he wanted you to make sure that everything was 100%,
right,
to his standards.
So people really even competed for how fast they were serving up the hot dogs, right?
Sure. Yeah, I remember my relatives saying things like, I served, 1,000 hamburgers in a day. I was the best. There was no one better than me. So they all kind of kept track to some extent of the quantities of food that they were pushing across the counter. And, of course, they were there all day long, every day, 7 days. Remember, they were working 7 days a week, especially for many of the early decades, including my grandfather. I mean, I don't know if we have time for the story, but my uncle convinced my grandfather to give people days off. And then one of the best workers got a bad sunburn and couldn't come in the next day. And my grandfather gave him hell for it. So 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. My grandfather worked more, 16 hours easy.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So you've talked about his generosity. I mean,
Yeah.
he might have been a tough boss. He might have worked really hard, but he was also really giving to people.
Sure. And also, I will point out that he didn't do anything that he would do anything that he asked of anyone else. In other words, he wasn't beneath him to pick up the garbage, do anything. It wasn't like, giving orders. But yeah, generous. I mean, many stories that he did things, secretly and not secretly sometimes, where he would pay for funerals, he would pay for, hospital stays, he would pay for people's first homes. He would give them no interest mortgages so they could buy their first homes. Lots of stories. Food, on holidays, free turkeys, parties for families where they give gifts to kids, charity, a lot of charity to people where he didn't want his name even associated. He gave to Catholic charities. He gave to Jewish charities. He helped out whoever he could. If you were poor and you couldn't afford something, he made sure you were fed. So he never forgot his roots. He never forgot being poor, never changed who he was, even though he became very successful.
What was that famous expression of his? Give him, I can't remember.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, he used to just shout out, give him and let him eat. He would stand on a crate in the corner. It was like an L-shaped counter. So he could be in the corner and look down both counters, both sides, and he would shout, give him and let him eat. And, it was like the charge to keep working, to keep up the speed, to keep up serving the people.
So that was him, but it was also, we talked about this before, it was kind of like the carnival barker atmosphere. And you told me that you promised me you were going to sing a song that some of the workers there sang.
Oh, yeah, I'll do my best. I mean, there were a lot of songs that they knew and they used to sing together on the counters, but there was one, if I get it, let me see if I get it right. Hamburger, hamburger, an onion in the middle and a pickle on top. I had to look at my cheat sheet, sorry. But there were other songs like that, that they used to sing. They had all kinds of little things to attract people and customers. I pointed out that they would, when they saw the train coming into the station, they put onions on the griddle because the smell from the onions would waft across the street and just sort of attract people there. My grandfather was clever with things. There's the famous story about he hired hospital orderlies to dress up as doctors with white coats and stethoscopes. And there was a sign that said, if doctors eat here, it must be good. Because, in the early days when it was a nickel, people thought it must be horse meat. They were convinced that the only way he could undercut everyone else, because everyone else was selling for their Frankfurter for a dime, that there was something wrong with the quality. And he had to convince them. And that was one of the things that he did.
And he succeeded because what are some of the figures about that? How many hot dogs did they actually sell on a typical weekend or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, on a busy weekend, and particularly 4th of July, which was probably the busiest, I mean, they could sell up to 75,000 Frankfurters in a day, if you think about it. And you think about the fries that went with that, the drinks, all the other items that they had to push out from the counter. And it wasn't that big a store. It wasn't the whole block like it is today. It wasn't until the 50s that it was like halfway down the block. So it wasn't a gigantic store that was, and yeah, by the 50s, I was told they were doing 3 million gross in that restaurant we're talking about nickels and dimes.
Right.
So
how did they even do that? How did they count the money?
I mean, they had to store it in barrels, and my grandfather and grandmother would often, like, after hours, or they weren't really after hours, but they would go into this room that was under the stairs that had no windows. So if they wanted to lock the door, they could have privacy, no one could see. And they would sit there and eat and put the money into rolls. I mean, they would roll the money. So they had to figure out all kinds of ways to store the money, count the money over many decades. And there was a lot of ingenuity that had to go into that process.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure. One thing that I heard is that he actually kept figures on a wall, and I think you compared it to like a computer almost.
Well, an accountant from the 70s told me that like that place was run like you were in IBM. In other words, I mean, they had quality control, they had quantity control. They counted everything before they started the day. They counted everything at the end of the day. On top of everything, they had charts that told them how much they would sell on a typical summer sunny day versus a typical a rainy day, or a
Right.
winter rainy day, or winter sunny. So they kind of knew the quantities that they had to prepare or get, have available. Because
Right.
you think about the ordering that was involved. The quantities of food that went through there were enormous. I mean, there's some figures that are just crazy when you read them.
So
Yeah.
now listen, did he eat the hot dogs himself?
Yeah, he definitely ate the Frankfurter or hot dog every day. I know I was in his office a few times, and he had a little stove, and he used to like his hot dog boiled, so he would boil it sometimes. Then
In his
occasionally
office.
he would order. He had an intercom. He would order up from downstairs, and he would have a Frankfurter that was grilled. So yeah, he was definitely someone who believed in tasting the food that he was serving. And in order to tell if the Frankfurter was good before it was cooked, he would chew on it and taste and see if there was too much water in it, if the spice was up to his specifications, and then he would spit it out. Right. So that was what I was talking about before, that he would send the truck back if he wasn't happy with the quality.
So what was that like for you, going to visit him in his office when you were a kid?
I was a little intimidated. It's like this little kid, like walking through this gigantic kitchen with all the workers pointing at me. And that's Nathan's grandson or something like, So I was a little bit shy, so a bit intimidating, but it was fun to be in his office, to sit on his couch and order some food and hang out there. But I was only there probably a couple times, actually, that I remember, several times.
Uh-huh. So, I mean, so your grandfather died when you were a teenager, and he had already been sort of semi-retired or retired to Florida. So you spent a lot of time with him down there. What was that like?
I have great memories of being in Florida with them. We stayed at their house. They had this beautiful house on the bay in Miami. They were very relaxed. My grandfather he always had a big smile on his face in general. He always seemed just happy with life. And he had fruit trees, so he took a lot of pride in the fruit trees. So we would have loquats, and we would have oranges, and he had bananas and papayas and mangoes. And he really took a lot of pride in that. And my grandmother would cook and, run around as a kid does and spin on her chairs and get yelled at by my grandmother. But yeah, she was very warm. My grandfather was very warm. A lot of really great memories of spending time there.
So it all sounds kind of homey in a way, but I know that some very famous people came to eat at Nathan's Famous. Who were some of them?
I mean, everyone came to Nathan's. New York wasn't New York. It wasn't like, the kind of place that attracted, people, or there wasn't the entertainment in New York that there is today. I mean, Nathan's was the place that everyone came to. So, a lot of famous comedians, Alan King and Buddy Hackett and Jerry Lewis and Zsa Zsa Gabor was there. And I mean, you name it, I think anyone who you could think of had gone down to Nathan's and ate down there. Maybe they wanted to be seen, I don't know. But there is also the famous story of they got a call that Jackie Onassis was coming down. And so they had this little dining room in the alleyway that was, only had like 10 tables, and they set it up for her so she could have a private meal. And I forget who she was with, one of her boyfriends. I think it was Mike Nichols, but I'm not 100% sure that I got that right.
Yeah.
So they ordered food in the dining room, and one of the waiters pointed out, I don't want to rat on her, but they didn't leave a tip. I don't know what that was about. I don't know. He told me that story. But there are a lot of super famous people and politicians. That was a big place for politicians to come, because of the crowd. So Rockefeller is in one of those pictures where you see my grandmother at the counter, Nelson Rockefeller and Louis Lefkowitz and, Robert Kennedy came down there and gave a speech, to the crowds, and I think Robert Kennedy only, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong, but and he was in my grandfather's office,
Wow.
and chatting with my grandfather at some point.
So that's pretty
Yeah.
amazing. So what do you, if you're going to chalk his success up to something, what would you say it's as a result of?
I mean, I think he learned a lot from his mother and the way she handled her business. She paid her farmers more than other people, and the margins were lower in some ways. And she once had a large amount of potatoes, and she made sure that every family got the potatoes. So I think he learned certain values from his mother, and he just innately, without education, knew that he wanted to keep the price low. He'd rather make no money than have customers be unhappy. And he knew that the quality had to be good, because food mattered a great deal to him. From his childhood of poverty, he really appreciated food and good quality food. So he just, and he had great workers. He had some of the best workers probably any restaurant has ever had in terms of speed and skill set. So it was just I think it was kind of like a unique, brilliant team of people that just made this whole place work and hum, for decades.
So do we have more pictures now or not? I can't remember whether we have more that we can look at. We do, good.
Yeah,
You want to talk to us a little bit about these?
Yeah, that's my grandfather. I'm not sure. I think he's in his 40s there. He looks pretty relaxed. I don't know if that's in Florida or where that is actually, because it does look like he has a bit of an apron type shirt on, but I'm not 100%. But that's my grandfather.
Okay.
And that's Ida, and my grandfather. She's pregnant with her first child. That's right outside of Nathan's on Surf Avenue. She's knitting something for the baby, and he's standing there, with his outfit from that era in the 1920s, early 1920s. You could see it's kind of empty around there.
Yeah.
In the street, you see that old vehicle. So
yeah, I see that.
And that's the 50th anniversary of Nathan's. My grandparents feeding each other, which they often did in photographs. The Frankfurter is, it's always on a bun. It was always toasted. I got to remember to say that. That was super important to him, that all the buns were toasted. And they got smaller as the years went on. They were really gigantic early on, and they had that famous casing when you bit into it, had that snap. Super high quality. And there was a celebration and a party where they had all the old machinery on a table behind them, and they're just celebrating all those years of work.
Wow. And their success.
Yeah, and that's early 20s. One of the earliest photographs. My grandparents are there with my uncle as a kid, and there's some other relatives, and you can see the menu, the early menu, and the prices. Frankfurter, roast beef hamburger, drinks, potato chips, like I said, which are French fries. Those were among the more expensive items. So most things were 5 cents. And even earlier than this, when he first started, things were 3 cents and 5 cents. Now it's 5 cents and 10 cents. But he kept the Frankfurter nickel until the 40s, until after the war, until he was forced to raise the price. For 30 years, he kept the same price. That tells you a lot about him.
Crazy. Yeah, that's amazing. Amazing.
And that's even earlier. You see Nathan's on the left. I don't even know if it was named at that time or had a sign. I can't tell if there's a sign there, but it's, for whatever reason, it's closed up at the time. But you see soda and the drinks and the root beer.
It says root beer.
Yeah, root beer. And like I might have said, he made his own sodas. He mixed everything. He bought all the ingredients. There was no Pepsi or Coke. Everything was made at the counter.
Yeah.
He went and bought all the ingredients at the various places in the Lower East Side, and the machinery too. And the signage got a lot more sophisticated over time.
Yeah, you've said how much you like that early signage, though.
Yeah. I mean, there was a famous sign painter down there in Coney Island. His name escapes me, but Beautiful signage.
Mhm.
And I love the Nathan's graphics. Yeah, look at that. I mean, that's incredible. That Nathan sign in the middle, that's vertical, that's lights up at night. That's one of the oldest signs. That's probably still there in 80, it's probably 80 years old. A lot of the other neon lights down below, but a lot of that's all hand painted, all those signs.
Right. And you were telling me that you think that the logo actually resembles his own handwriting a little bit.
Yeah, if you look at I have some checks of his that he signed, and he was even a little rougher. The signs, the logo changed a little bit, the lettering, but it feels very familiar to his handwriting, to how he signed Nathan. Just it was a little more rough, like I said, but I think they definitely got influenced by that to some extent. But yeah, look at all this is 1950s, so you can see it. It ended halfway in the block, right? And that's when they introduced seafood first, was early 1950s. So that's how I know. But look at the crowds. And, the cars double parked. The police let them double park and run in. But you think of how fast they had to be to satisfy people that were in that kind of crowd, I think they were faster then than if you have 5 people today trying to get your food. And that's how quick they were.
Right.
There's one guy that supposedly served 60 frankfurters in 60 seconds. That was Sammy Fiorello, who was in the first frankfurter spot in the griddle in the corner. So anyway.
But you said, you told me that it was kind of like a ballet working there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just again, the speed, when it was busy, in other words, the kitchen, they had a dozen people toasting buns in the kitchen, so they can bring them out in time to serve people. They were, they had to, start the cooking of the potatoes. They blanched the potatoes in the kitchen before they finished it off outside. So the timing of everything had to be real exact. They had to work top speed, and you see the crowds. That tells you everything, right?
That tells you everything, right?
Yeah.
So I think we're going to see if we can answer some questions in the chat. But first of all, I just want to ask you though, what do you personally take away from your relationship with your grandfather? What do you remember? What's most meaningful to you?
Well, just, extremely down to earth people, warm, humble, never forgot their roots. I think a lot about immigration. I think about all the controversy that goes on today around immigration. And I think about my grandfather, who had 0 education, came here with practically nothing. And look what he made out of himself and for all these people that he employed, right? And so when you think about like how we're going to judge who should come into this country, I think you should think about my grandparents and who they were and what they created. And, I just personally have great love for them and for what kind of people they were, not just their success and their work ethic.
Right. Well, he is such an amazing example for us all, I think. So
Sure.
let me see if we have any questions in the chat.
Sure.
Okay. What a success story.
True. Absolutely.
Okay, somebody says, after a day at the beach, the highlight of the evening was for Mom to buy her 3 little girls a Nathan hot dog. We all shared an order of the fried potatoes before we took the train home.
Yeah.
Somebody else says,
those fries were amazing. They were.
Somebody
really
says,
delicious.
I'm getting hungry.
Yeah.
Someone said, one of the photos you can see of a kitchen, and it almost looks like one of the kitchens on Ellis Island. And that's something we also talked about when we toured the place, that you saw a walk-in fridge. Right.
Right. Yeah. They had these, they had a stand at the World's Fair, 1939 World's Fair, and they purchased the refrigerators, these giant walk-in refrigerators with the old wooden doors, and they installed those in Nathan. So I just have a strong memory of those. The griddle itself was, like at its longest, I think like 32 feet long.
Mhm.
And you could turn on the flames in each individual section
Mm.
so that they could cook it gradually and slide it down to the end. They had like, so that talk about a ballet. So that was a ballet. The
Right.
control of the heat of the griddle as it moved down as it moved down the counter. Also, the counters were at the front of the store. They're no longer there. They're
Wow.
right at the street. So you're serving right there. Now they're in the back. They're pushed back like most fast food restaurants are. You walk in, you wait online, etc. It was a different setup.
And also, I mean, it was fast, but it wasn't fast food.
Yeah, well, in the sense, again, that I remind people, I mean, it was more of a mom and pop restaurant. The food was fresh. They went to the seafood markets to get the seafood that day. The hamburgers were made on premises. They had butchers that were working there. Yeah, nothing frozen, all fresh. Potatoes, fresh, peeled, got every spot out of there. My grandfather would blew a stack if he saw something he didn't like in the potatoes,
Yeah.
and they had a guy named Jerry Minetti who helped design and invent certain, iterations of the fryolator. So they changed the oil often, and he knew how to perfect the outside and the inside of the potato. So it was just perfect. So yeah, there was a lot of skill involved. Let's put it that way. So it wasn't just regular fast food.
All right. What about you? Do you still eat a Nathan's hot dog once in a while, or have you given up on the whole thing?
I don't eat a lot of Frankfurters. Let's put it that way. I have nostalgia for the old days when it was more like a sausage.
Mhm.
It's shrunken, it's skinnier. Managers have told me that it doesn't taste quite the same, in terms of the content. Plus, you do know that it's not the healthiest to eat too many of. Let's put it that way. So we're a little more knowledgeable maybe about, eating a lot of processed meat.
Right.
What can I say?
Yeah, I mean, if he came along now, maybe he would be cooking something completely different that would be just as successful. Who knows?
Maybe. Right.
Anyway, so is there anything we haven't talked? I could talk to you for hours, but is there anything that we haven't shared yet that you'd like to?
Trying to think. Well, I mean, the workers, like United Nations, I pointed that out, that they were from all ethnic backgrounds, from all over the world. I think, and people have told me that he was the first person to integrate the counter in Coney Island for Black workers to be on the counter. But they came from all over the world, and they worked harmoniously. And, my grandfather, for him, they were like a family. He sent fruit to them from Florida. Like he gave them turkeys. He really wanted a family atmosphere and people to be happy. And he paid them really well. That's another thing to remember. He paid them better than most other people in that area, and maybe, in a restaurant. And he gave them bonuses, really good bonuses every year too. So, because he always said he'd rather them have the money or the customers have the money than the government have the money. Because he was in a high tax bracket, and back then people don't remember that, like especially during World War II, the taxes on him were 90%. So he paid 90 and 95% one year on his taxes. So that was the income tax level. So he'd rather the money went into the business and to people and workers. So
What a guy.
Yeah, he was a good guy.
He was a good guy.
He was a good guy.
All right, Lloyd. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. It was so much fun
Thanks.
talking to you, fun taking you around the other day.
Yeah, thanks for that tour, that great tour. I hope they renovate those buildings. I hope they rehabilitate those buildings because they're incredible.
Yeah.
And they should be preserved if it's at all possible. I know it's expensive to do those kind of things, but they're amazing buildings, and I wish everyone could have that tour and see them.
One thing I forgot that I wanted to ask you about is where your documentary has been shown before.
Well, it played at a lot of Jewish film festivals. It played abroad in Europe in various countries. It played in Israel. So quite a lot of places in the United States and then overseas as well. It came out in 2014 it was in the Tribeca Film Festival. And then we wrote the book. I wrote the book with Gil.
With Gil Revel, yeah.
Yeah, right. Okay, I got to pronounce his name right. Yeah, we worked together really hard on that book, and it's got even more details and more information than the documentary, but they both work well together.
Well, the documentary is really nice because it's so personal, I think.
Yeah.
And it's a real personal statement, which makes sense coming from you. And and it also is streaming. I saw it recently again on, I can't remember which service, but it is streaming.
Could be on Amazon. It was on Netflix.
Yeah, so you can still see it. And of course, you can go to Amazon and buy the book.
Right, that's it.
Yeah. Okay, so let's say good night. Thank you all for being with us today. We are going to be here in another month. We're going to be talking with Catherine Good about historic preservation. And that should be a lot of fun. You can also go on our website and see other upcoming virtual events, find out about becoming a member, about taking a hard hat tour. So we hope to see you soon. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks.
Thank you, Lloyd.
Thank you.